Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to the channel, and I am here for a versus video for you guys. Now for this video, I'm going to be talking about two bands. Once again, this is another band versus video. I know it's been a bit since I've last done one of these, but for this one, I want to talk about Metallica and Megadeth, and we're going to compare these two bands. Now obviously, these are some bands that do get compared a lot within the metal community, and it really does, the question does raise around with a lot of people, like, which is truly the better band? Well, this is definitely a tough one for me, so I'm going to, talk a little bit about each era of the band, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and even the 2010s. So, yeah, Metallica versus Megadeth, let's get on with it. So, we begin with the 80s. As far as the 80s, I would definitely say Metallica takes the cake as far as the majority of the 80s stuff goes. Now, that's not to say that Megadeth has never had any good albums in the 1980s or anything, don't get me wrong. But I think Metallica really does win when it comes to the 1980s era. I mean, in the 80s you got Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Justice for All. And all the Megadeth albums that came out in the 80s were really good as well, especially Peace Sells But Who's Buying. But I just have to say that Metallica definitely wins as far as the 80s time goes. So next we move on to the 90s. Now this is where it gets kind of tough. This is where the other band kind of has the upper hand here. That's right, I do think that Megadeth is better in the 1990s than Metallica was in the 90s. I mean, think about it. I mean, you had Rust in Peace. I mean, come on, this is the era of Rust in Peace, one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. That came out in the 90s, early 90s, of course, I believe 1990 actually. But yeah, this is the era of that album, one of the greatest albums. And you also got Countdown to Extinction, Cryptic Writings, and some others. Now sure, you had Risk as well, and Risk, it's a decent album, but it is one of their weakest. And then, with Metallica, you had, of course, the Black Album, which, maybe the Black Album might be, something that makes Metallica better than Megadeth in the 90s for some people. But to me, the Black Album is not as great as some people make it out to be. It is a great album, yes, but come on. Over Megadeth's material of the 90s? I don't think so. But yeah, it is a great album nonetheless. And then of course you had Load and Reload, which are decent, not their best work. So yeah, really, the Black Album is really the only thing Metallica had going for them in the 90s. Now sure, you had Garage Incorporated and S&M and those stuff, but I don't know. I definitely think Megadeth has the upper hand here when it comes to the 90s. And same could be said about the next decade, the 2000s. Now, Megadeth easily better than Metallica in the 2000s. With Metallica, of course, you had Saint Anger, their worst album, of course. You also had Death Magnetic, which I think is another one of their worst, to be honest. But with Megadeth, man, I mean, you had The World Needs a Hero, which it's an okay album. I mean, not the strongest replay value, but it's pretty good. And then you also had The System Has Failed, which I think is actually pretty good. It's a pretty good album. And you also had United Abominations, which is alright. And then you also had Endgame, which is actually a pretty good album. So, yeah, Megadeth, I mean, I think they blow Metallica out of the water when it comes to the 2000s era. I mean that just goes without saying, in my opinion. I mean, that's just the truth. So now we move on to the 2010s era. Now Metallica has really only had Hardwired to Self-Destruct come out in the 2010s. If you don't count Lulu, of course, which that would be their weakest if we are counting that one. But I do have to say that I think Megadeth also wins for the 2010s. Now sure, in the 2010s you had Super Collider, which in my opinion is Megadeth's worst album, but even though that is the case, you also had what's that album, 13, which is an okay album. I mean, again, it kind of sits in the same boat as The World Needs a Hero for me. It's a decent album, but just not the strongest replay value. But you also had Dystopia, which I think is their best album, maybe since the 90s. One of their 90s albums, for sure. I don't know, I really dig Dystopia, though. It's still a great album. And, yeah, I would definitely say Megadeth also wins for the 2010s. Now, it is a little debatable, of course, because with Hardwired to Self-Destruct, that is a good album, but it's not as good as some people claim it to be, I think. Yes, I would agree it's probably their best album since, you know, their 90s work or whatever, maybe since the Black Album or Load or something. I would agree, but it doesn't even reach the heights of those albums. Like, you would expect, like, something as good as those albums. You know, that's what, like, some people claim it to be, but no, that's not the case. So I would say that Megadeth does win overall in the 2010s. So, as you can see, Metallica has really only won one out of, you know, 4 decades of their career, while Megadeth has won 3 out of 4. So you would think that Megadeth would take the cake for this video, right? Well, for this one, I gotta go with a tie. Now, this one actually might be coming off as very surprising since, you know, Megadeth has, you know, been really nailing it. You know, everything after the 80s, I think. Even in the 80s time, they were really good still. Again, that's not to say that I don't think their 80s work is good. It's still solid, and it's still, even to this day, debatable, you know, because there's some people that actually think Megadeth's best work came from the 1980s. But I gotta give it to Metallica as far as the 80s time goes. The reason I gotta go with a tie, though, is because when it comes to the best Metallica albums, the best Metallica albums are, like, really, really good. You know, they're, like, 10 out of 10 albums, especially Ride the Lightning. You know, and a lot of their 80s work is just fantastic. But while I would say that, you know, Megadeth has had excellent albums to come out in the 80s and the 90s, some albums I would not say are 10 out of 10s. Now, obviously, Rust in Peace is a 10 out of 10 album, but some albums, like Cryptic Writings, which I think is a great album, but a 10 out of 10, no, I would not say so. You know, and same could be said about, you know, some of their 2000s albums and 2010s albums. Like, in my opinion, there's nothing that Megadeth put out in the 2000s or the 2010s that I would say is a 10 out of 10 score, in my opinion. Now, maybe some people might say Dystopia is, but that, for me, is maybe like an 8 out of 10. But yeah, that's still a great album, though. But I don't know. I got to go with a tie here because, again, the Metallica albums from the 80s are, like, they're excellent. They're excellent albums. Like, some of them are just 10 out of 10 for sure. But I don't know. I think Megadeth has been more consistent through their career, even though they have experimented. But the experimentation, I don't know. But let me know what you guys think. Which band do you like more, Metallica or Megadeth? Again, I'm going to have to go with a tie here, so let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day, and take care.